I spent 40 years as an engineer, trusting only what I could measure, but in the winter of 1991, while broadcasting an English lesson to an empty frequency from my isolated cabin in Montana, the void answered back. I captured 200 hours of reel-to-reel tape, proving that the creature we call Bigfoot didn't just mimic my words, he learned them, he spoke to me, and he became the best student I ever had, until I realized that teaching him to speak was the very thing that would get him killed. Before we tune into the frequency, let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you're fascinated by the intelligence hidden in the deep woods, please subscribe to the channel for more stories. The Bitterroot Mountains don't just surround you, they insulate you. I'm Arthur Jessup, and back in 1991, at 63 years old, I had voluntarily walled myself off from the world. I was a structural engineer by trade, a man who spent 40 years calculating load-bearing capacities and stress factors in Seattle. When I retired to this 40-acre patch of timber near the Idaho border, I wasn't looking for peace. I was looking for a variable I could control. The silence here wasn't empty, it was structural, a solid thing you could lean against when the rest of your life had eroded away. My world centered on the shack, a reinforced annex off the main cabin filled with the warm amber glow of vacuum tubes and the smell of ozone. I was a ham radio operator, call sign K7QX, but I wasn't interested in the idle chatter or the contest swapping of the hobby. I had built a cathedral of electronics, vintage Collins transmitters, oscilloscopes, and a massive Yagi antenna that scraped the sky like a steel pine tree. It was an engineer's playground, a place where physics still obeyed the rules, unlike the messy, unpredictable grief that waited for me in the rest of the house. Eleanor had been gone for 3 years, but the house still held her breath in the curtains and the floorboards. She was a teacher, a woman who believed that knowledge was the only thing that didn't decay. Without her, the silence was deafening. I found myself talking to the walls, to the coffee pot, desperate for the sound of a voice that wasn't my own internal monologue. That's how the broadcast started. I wasn't trying to reach anyone specific. I was just trying to keep the language from dying out in my own throat. I didn't broadcast the usual 73s or weather reports that clogged the amateur bands. I ran a school for ghosts. Every night at 1900 hours, I fired up the rig and sent a lesson out into the ionosphere. I read from encyclopedias, explained the laws of thermodynamics, and recited American history. It was a one-way transfer of data, a stubborn attempt to impose order on the chaos of the night. "This is K7QX, I'd say, my voice steady and professorial. Tonight's lesson, the structure of the atom." I focused heavily on English, channeling Eleanor's old lesson plans that I found in the attic. I broke words down to their phonemes, enunciating with exaggerated clarity into the ribbon microphone. Tree, T-R-E-E, a tall plant with a trunk and branches. I left pauses in the transmission, deliberate spaces of dead air for an imaginary student to repeat the word back to me. It was a ritual, a liturgy of syntax and vocabulary performed for an audience of deer, spruce trees, and static. My days were governed by a rigid schedule, a scaffold to keep me from collapsing into depression. I prepped my scripts on yellow legal pads, organizing the curriculum with the same precision I used to design bridges. Monday was science, Tuesday was history, Wednesday was language arts. It gave me a purpose. I wasn't just an old hermit rotting in a cabin. I was an educator. I was maintaining the archives of civilization, even if no one was checking out the books. Radio is a strange magic. You throw a voice into a wire and it skips off the atmosphere, landing God knows where. Sometimes I'd get a confirmation card in the mail from a guy in Japan or a ship captain off the coast of Madagascar. Those brief connections were proof of life, but they were fleeting and impersonal. Mostly, I broadcasted into the black hole of the Rockies. I was a lighthouse keeper with no ships to guide, sweeping my beam of knowledge across a dark, indifferent ocean night after night. There is a specific kind of loneliness that comes from speaking into a microphone and watching the needle bounce, knowing the sound is traveling at the speed of light but hitting nothing. It felt like shouting into a canyon and waiting for an echo that never came. But I kept doing it. I kept teaching the conjugation of verbs and the history of the Roman Empire because stopping meant admitting that I was truly, finally alone. The broadcasts were my anchor to the world of men. The summer of 1991 was a scorcher. The heat sat heavy in the valley, and the air was thick with static electricity and the scent of dry pine needles. The radio propagation was wild that year. Signals were bouncing in from places they shouldn't have, distorting and fading. The shack felt different, charged with a latent energy that made the hair on my arm stand up. I'd sit there in the dark, the tubes glowing like embers, feeling a strange pressure in the room, as if the air itself was waiting for something to happen. I started to get the feeling that the classroom wasn't as empty as I thought. It wasn't a sound exactly, not at first. It was a presence, a feeling of attention that pricked the back of my neck. I would finish a lesson on basic nouns, release the push-to-talk button, and stare at the signal strength meter. Usually it dropped dead to zero. But in late August, the needle started to twitch. Just a little. Someone was on the frequency. Someone was keying a mic, holding their breath and listening. "Good evening, class," I would say to the unblinking red light on the console. It was a phrase that felt heavy with irony, but I refused to let it sound pathetic. I treated the transmission with the same gravity as a university lecture, straightening my back in the swivel chair and adjusting the gain on the microphone. I wasn't just talking to myself, I was maintaining a standard. If civilization had ended and I was the last man with a working transmitter, I wanted the archives of human knowledge to be broadcast with dignity, not the ramblings of a madman. My curriculum was a patchwork of Eleanor's old textbooks and my own engineering manuals. I started with the basics of phonetics, the building blocks of speech. The letter B, I would intone, leaning into the mic. Ba, ball, bear, box. I held up the flashcards I had made, showing them to the empty room as if the radio waves could carry the image along with the sound. It was a ritual of memory, tracing the pedagogical steps my wife had taken with 1,000 first graders. In teaching the airwaves, I was keeping her methodology alive. The most difficult part was the pause. Eleanor always said you have to leave room for the student to think, to form the words in their own mouth. So, after every prompt, I let the dead air hang for 10 seconds. Repeat after me. Water. Silence. Water. Those 10 seconds were an eternity. The only sound was the hum of the transformer and the wind rattling the window pane. It was a void that threatened to swallow me whole, a reminder that the class was a fiction I had constructed to stave off the crushing weight of solitude. I often visualized who might be on the other end. In my more optimistic moments, I imagined a lonely rancher in Wyoming, snowed in with a shortwave receiver, chuckling at the old man teaching the alphabet, or perhaps a long-haul trucker on the I-90, drifting through the pass, finding comfort in the human voice. But deep down, I suspected my audience consisted mostly of the Douglas firs and the granite peaks. I was lecturing to the landscape, trying to impose the logic of syntax onto a wilderness that spoke only in wind and avalanches. Technically, I was broadcasting into a vacuum. My logbook was filled with dates and times of transmission, but the comments column remained stubbornly blank. Signal report, 599. Reception, unknown. As an engineer, I dealt in feedback loops. You send a signal, you get a return. Without that return, the system is open, incomplete. Yet, I persisted. I treated the silence not as a failure, but as a potential. The signal was out there. It was bouncing off the ionosphere. Physics didn't care if anyone heard it. The wave existed regardless of the observer. Some nights, the futility of it nearly broke me. I would sit there with the dictionary open, ready to explain the definition of gravity, and feel a wave of exhaustion so profound it made my hands shake. Why was I doing this? Who cared about the conjugation of to be in a cabin 10 miles from the nearest paved road? But then I would look at Eleanor's picture on the shelf, and I would remember her voice. Education is an act of faith art, she used to say. You plant the seed, and you may never see it grow. So I kept planting. I expanded the lessons to include survival skills, blending my engineering background with the practicalities of mountain life. Leverage, I explained one Tuesday. Give me a lever long enough, and I can move the world. This is how you lift a log. I described how to purify water, how to identify Polaris, how to triangulate a position. It felt more relevant than Shakespeare. If anyone was out there, lost, cold, or hiding, maybe these lessons would be worth more than a grammar rule. I was casting a safety net made of words. The radio became a confessional of sorts. In the spaces between lessons, I found myself sharing small details of my life. The snow is deep today, I'd tell the static. The generator is acting up. I miss the smell of the ocean. It was a way to externalize the internal monologue that plagues the isolated. I wasn't just teaching, I was testifying to my own existence. I am here, the signal said. I am still thinking. I am still speaking. It was a defiance against the erasing power of the mountains. The seasons turned, turning the green timber to white, and the isolation deepened. The winter of '91 was brutal, burying the shack in drifts that reached the windows. The radio was my only way out. I poured more energy into the broadcasts, extending the lessons to 90 minutes. I read entire chapters of The Call of the Wild, acting out the voices, losing myself in the story. The fiction was a relief from the reality of the frozen world outside. I was the narrator of a story no one was reading. Then came the night in late August when the dynamic of the room shifted. I had just finished a segment on the sounds of the vowels. and was holding the 10-second pause for the imaginary repetition of, "Oh, open." I released the key, expecting the usual wash of white noise. Instead, the squelch broke. It wasn't a clean transmission. It was a burst of static, rhythmic and jagged, followed by a sound that made my heart stop. It was a guttural, distorted tone, wet and heavy, but it had a cadence. It sounded like something trying to clear a throat that had never formed a word before. The first time it happened, I blamed the equipment. It was a Tuesday night, and the needle on the signal strength meter kicked hard to the right, burying itself in the red before dropping back to zero. It sounded like a dead key, someone pressing the transmission button without speaking. But there was a texture to the silence. It wasn't the clean hiss of an open carrier. It was filled with a low-frequency rumble, a wet breathing sound that rattled my subwoofer. I tapped the dial, thinking a capacitor had blown or a tube was microphonic. But the equipment was running cool. The signal was external. I leaned into the microphone, my heart doing a strange flutter in my chest. "Is there a station on frequency?" I asked, using the standard protocol. "This is K7QX. Please identify." Silence. Then a burst of static followed by a sound that defied categorization. It was a grunt, but it had an upward inflection, like a question mark made of gravel. Uh-huh. It was distinct, biological, and alarmingly loud. Whoever was transmitting wasn't bouncing a signal off the ionosphere from Russia. They were pushing a ground wave. They were close. My engineer's brain immediately went to triangulation. A signal that strong with no atmospheric fading, QSB, meant the transmitter was likely within a 20-mile radius. It had to be a neighbor, maybe one of the ranchers down in the valley playing a prank or a lost hunter messing with a handheld unit. "Very funny," I muttered, half relieved. "If you're in trouble, state your emergency. Otherwise, please clear the frequency." I waited. The response came back instantly. A long, low moan that modulated in pitch, mimicking the cadence of my own sentence. It wasn't mocking. It was trying to match my rhythm. I decided to run a test. I went back to the lesson plan, but I simplified it. "Apple," I said, enunciating clearly. "A-P-P-L-E. I left the 10-second pause. The squelch broke at the 3-second mark. "Ar-ghoul." The sound was crude, strangled, as if the speaker had a mouthful of marbles, but the syllable count was perfect. 2 beats. Apple. Ar-ghoul. The hair on my arm stood up. A drunk rancher doesn't mimic phonemes with that kind of rhythmic precision. This was an attempt at reproduction. I spent the next hour working through a list of simple nouns. Dog, duga, cat, kata. The responses were guttural and heavy, vibrating in the lower registers of the audio spectrum. The voice had a chestiness to it that was physically impossible for a normal human male. It sounded like a bass drum covered in wet fur. There was a struggle in the sound, a physical exertion to force the air through a vocal tract that wasn't designed for English. It sounded painful, wet, and incredibly determined. I recorded everything. I had an Ampex reel-to-reel connected to the receiver output, and I watched the tape spin, capturing every grunt and wheeze. Seeing the waveform on the oscilloscope was terrifying. The amplitude of the lower frequencies was massive. When the mystery station transmitted, the scope didn't just spike, it flooded with noise in the 50 Hz range. This wasn't just a voice. It was a growl wrapped in a desperate attempt at civility. I labeled the tape, "Unknown Station, Local," and sat back, my hands trembling. The strangest part was the lack of radio etiquette. There was no call sign, no over, no Roger. The transmission cut in and out abruptly, often clipping the beginning or end of the sound. It suggested a Vox system, voice-operated transmission, or someone mashing a button with clumsy, oversized fingers. It felt raw and unpolished, like someone had found a radio and was figuring out the interface by trial and error. But the intent was undeniable. They weren't jamming me, they were attending the class. I spent the next few days scanning the perimeter of my property, looking for tire tracks or boot prints. If someone was that close, I should have seen signs. But the snow was pristine. No one had driven up the access road in weeks. The signal was coming from the deep woods, from the sectors where there were no cabins, no power lines, and no roads. The logical explanation, a human neighbor, was dissolving. I was left with the impossible alternative. Someone was out there in the timber, surviving the winter without a roof, and they wanted to learn how to speak. The nightly sessions became a surreal duet. I would teach, and the darkness would answer. I found myself tailoring the lessons to the struggle I heard in the voice. I stopped using words with hard S sounds because the responder couldn't make them. They came out as wet whistles. I focused on vowels and hard consonants. Go. Go. No. No. The progress was slow, agonizingly so, but it was there. The student was practicing. I could hear them muttering the words under their breath before keying the mic, rehearsing the sounds before committing them to the airwaves. By the end of September, the dynamic had shifted from curiosity to obsession. I wasn't afraid of the voice anymore. I was captivated by the effort behind it. There was a hunger in those garbled transmissions, a desperate need to bridge the gap between my world of words and their world of silence. I realized that whatever was on the other end of that radio signal wasn't just mimicking me like a parrot. It was analyzing, processing, and modifying its own biology to fit the shape of my language. October bled into November, burying the cabin under 3 feet of powder. But inside the shack, the atmosphere was electric with discovery. The progression of the student, as I had begun to call him in my logs, was defying every model of learning I knew. In the beginning, he had struggled to isolate syllables, his voice a blunt instrument smashing against the delicate vowels of English. But as the weeks passed, the signal-to-noise ratio of his speech improved dramatically. The wet, gargling distortion began to fade, replaced by a rough but controlled articulation. He was learning how to shape his mouth, how to curb the massive volume of air in his lungs to produce a whisper instead of a roar. I tracked his vocabulary on a graph pinned to the wall, the line rising at an exponential angle. We moved past the nursery rhymes of cat and dog into the functional utility of verbs. Walk, run, sleep. The student didn't just repeat these words. He practiced them with a terrifying intensity. I would hear him late at night, long after the lesson had ended, keying the mic for split seconds to mutter, "Sleep, sleep." He was drilling himself. It wasn't the mindless mimicry of a mynah bird. It was the deliberate, repetitive study of a scholar trying to master a foreign tongue. The most startling realization was that he was understanding context. One evening, I was teaching the word wind, while a blizzard hammered the eaves of the cabin. I said the word, and he responded, "Wind," followed immediately by a sharp, blowing sound into the microphone, a mimicry of the gale outside. He wasn't just matching sound to sound, he was matching sound to phenomenon. He understood that the word was a label for the reality we were both experiencing. That cognitive leap, from phonetics to semantics, is the divide between animal instinct and sentient intelligence. He had crossed it. He began to self-correct, a trait that gave me goosebumps. If I said river and he grunted riva, he would pause, make a frustrated chuffing noise, and try again. River. He was auditing his own performance against the template of my voice. This required an internal feedback loop, a mental mirror where he could compare his output to the desired input. It proved he possessed a critical mind, capable of analyzing error and implementing a fix in real time. He wanted to get it right. He cared about the precision of the syntax. The physical timbre of his voice remained the biggest hurdle and the most fascinating data point. It was deep, resonating in the sub-bass frequencies that usually get cut off by standard radio filters. I had to modify my receiver, widening the bandwidth to capture the full fidelity of his transmissions. What I heard was a vocal tract of immense size, a larynx that was likely twice the size of a human's. He had to pitch his voice up to speak English, straining to hit the tenor range where our language lives. It sounded like a cello trying to play a violin concerto, a beautiful, straining effort against biology. By December, he had mastered over 50 words, including abstract concepts like hot, cold, and hungry. The speed of acquisition was faster than a human child, suggesting a fully developed adult brain rewiring itself on the fly. I introduced 2-word combinations. Big tree, cold snow. The first time he successfully linked an adjective to a noun, I nearly wept. Cooled water, he croaked back to me. It was a sentence, a primitive declarative sentence. He was describing his world to me. I started leaving the radio on 24/7, turning the volume down low so I could sleep. Often I would wake up at 3 a.m. to the sound of the squelch breaking, followed by the student practicing words from weeks ago. Fire, fire, hot. He was reviewing the curriculum in his downtime. It spoke of a profound loneliness on his end, a hunger for this connection that matched my own. We were 2 hermits, separated by miles of snow and biology, meeting in the electromagnetic spectrum to share the warmth of language. The emotional range of his voice began to color the transmissions. In the early days, everything sounded aggressive due to the sheer power of his lungs. But as he gained control, I heard nuance. When he struggled with a word, the tone was plaintive, almost whining. When he succeeded, there was a rising inflection of pride. Good, I would tell him. Good, he would reply, the word vibrating with satisfaction. We were building a rapport, a teacher-student bond forged in the static. I realized I was no longer broadcasting to a who, but to a him. The anonymity was fading. I could recognize his breathing pattern, the specific way he clicked the mic button. likely with a thumb given the heavy thud, the rhythm of his hesitation. He was becoming a known quantity, a personality. I found myself making coffee in the morning and wondering what he was doing, if he was safe, if he was practicing the word breakfast. The abstraction of the listener had solidified into the reality of a companion. But with the progress came the inevitable question that I had been suppressing. A human hermit living in the woods might be eccentric, but they wouldn't struggle to pronounce the letter P for 3 weeks. They wouldn't have a voice that registered at 40 hertz. They wouldn't need to be taught that fire is hot. The acoustic evidence was piling up, pointing to a conclusion that my engineering mind refused to accept. The biology on the other end of that signal wasn't human. And if it wasn't human, and it wasn't an animal, then what the hell was I teaching? The conclusion didn't arrive like a lightning bolt. It accumulated like snow, layer by heavy layer, until the structure of my denial finally collapsed. I'm an engineer. I don't believe in myths, I believe in data, and the data was screaming at me. I had run the audio through a makeshift spectral analyzer, watching the frequency distribution. The fundamental frequency of the student's voice sat at 85 hertz, far lower than the deepest human bass. The lung capacity required to sustain his long single-breath vocalizations calculated out to roughly 12 liters, double that of a large man. The math didn't allow for a human operator. I sat in the shack one freezing January night, staring at the glowing tubes of the Collins transmitter, forcing myself to confront the impossible. The student didn't know what a wheel was. He didn't understand money or house, but he knew elk, night, and moon intimately. A human hermit, no matter how isolated, carries the cultural baggage of their species. This student started from zero. He wasn't recovering lost language. He was discovering it for the first time. I whispered the word into the silence of the room, tasting the taboo of it. Sasquatch. Once I allowed that variable into the equation, everything solved. The lack of dexterity on the microphone button, the nocturnal habits, the immense acoustic power, the struggle with labial sounds, it all fit the profile of a massive non-human primate. Fear should have been my primary reaction. I was interacting with an apex predator capable of snapping my spine, but my curiosity was a stronger drug. I was standing on the edge of the greatest anthropological discovery in history. I wasn't just a radio operator anymore. I was the first contact specialist for the human race. I decided not to flee, but to adapt. If my student was a Bigfoot, I had to stop teaching him like a human child and start teaching him like a linguistic pioneer. I restructured the entire curriculum. I dropped the abstract concepts of civilization and focused on the concrete reality of the forest. I slowed my cadence, pitching my voice lower to match his hearing range. I stripped the grammar down to its bones. Subject-verb. No adjectives, no flowery prose. I was creating a pidgin dialect, a bridge language designed specifically for his vocal anatomy. I realized I needed to document this with forensic precision. I dusted off my high-end Ampex reel-to-reel recorder, a machine usually reserved for studio masters. I threaded a fresh spool of magnetic tape, the rust-colored ribbon promising fidelity that the cassette deck couldn't match. I set the recording speed to 15 inches per second to capture the infrasound nuances of his voice. Every grunt, every pause, every click of his transmitter was now being archived. If I disappeared, these tapes would be my testimony. I began to test his self-awareness, a critical marker of sentience. I taught the words for anatomy: hand, foot, mouth. Then I took a risk. Fur, I said. Fu-er. There was a long pause on the frequency. Then a soft, vibrating chuff came back. Fur. He understood. He looked at his own arm, saw the hair, and applied the label. It was a moment of electric connection. He wasn't just a beast in the woods. He was an entity capable of self-reflection. He knew what he was, and now he knew the word for it. The logistics of his side of the conversation plagued my mind. How did he have a radio? I theorized a plane crash, or perhaps a dead hiker's backpack found years ago. He must have scavenged a handheld transceiver, maybe a military surplus unit with a simple push-to-talk interface. The image of him, 8 feet of muscle and hair huddled over a tiny plastic box, using a thumb the size of a bratwurst to gently press the button, was both terrifying and poignant. It spoke of an intelligence that could repurpose human tools for its own ends. I became protective of the frequency. I scanned the bands religiously, terrified that another operator might stumble upon our sessions. If a local rancher or a passing trucker heard the guttural booming voice of the student, the hunt would begin. I started using codes. Classes in session meant it was safe. Clear the air meant silence. I was teaching him operational security before he even knew what a gun was. I was grooming him to survive the discovery I was helping him facilitate. The dynamic shifted from teacher-student to something more collaborative. I stopped lecturing and started listening. I would play a sound, a bird call, the sound of breaking ice, and wait for him to label it. He began to correct me on the nature sounds. If I played a recording of a coyote and called it dog, he would growl a sharp negation. No, yip dog. He was refining the taxonomy. He was teaching me the nuance of the forest, using the tools I had given him to correct my clumsy human categorizations. By the time the thaw arrived in early '92, the foundation was laid. We had a vocabulary of 200 words and a mutual understanding of the rules. The grunts had smoothed into a gravelly slow-motion version of English. The Ampex tape spun night after night, capturing the evolution of a mind waking up to a larger world. I looked at the signal meter, bouncing in rhythm with his voice, and knew we were past the point of simple vocabulary drills. He was ready to stop repeating and start creating. Spring arrived in the Bitterroot Valley not as a gentle awakening, but as a violent rupture of ice and mud. The noise of the thaw was deafening, but inside the shack, the silence was being broken by something far more earth-shattering. In April 1992, the student crossed the Rubicon. He stopped merely repeating my words and began arranging them into his own architecture. The breakthrough happened on a Tuesday. I had keyed the mic to say, "The sun is warm," and released the button. The response was immediate, loud, and terrifyingly original. Sun, melt, snow. He hadn't just mimicked. He had observed, processed, and formulated a completely new declarative sentence. The dynamic of our sessions shifted instantly from a lecture to a conversation. The student began to understand the power of the question mark. "What is that?" became his favorite phrase. He would hold the transmit button down and let me hear a sound, the distant rumble of a jet engine or the howl of a wolf, and wait for me to label it. "Plane," I would explain. "Machine, fly." He would grunt, absorbing the taxonomy. "Plane, loud," he would reply. "No, like." He was expressing an opinion. He wasn't just a recording device, he was a critic. The most chilling moment came when he asked about me. For months, I had been a disembodied voice in his hand. One night, the static cleared, and his deep, gravelly bass filled the room. "Where? Arthur?" Hearing my own name, distorted by a larynx the size of a diesel exhaust pipe, froze the blood in my veins. He understood that Arthur was the label for the entity on the other end. "I'm here," I stammered, pointing to the map on my wall, though he couldn't see it. "In the cabin. The wood house." There was a pause, then a thoughtful chuff. "Wood, house, safe." We began to trade daily reports. I would tell him about the garden I was planting. He would tell me about the movement of the herds. "Elk, go, high," he reported one evening, his voice straining to articulate the vowels. "Grass, green, up." It was a hunting report. He was sharing the logistics of his survival with me. I realized I was getting a real-time feed of the ecosystem from an apex predator. He saw things I couldn't, the shifting patterns of the game, the arrival of the bears, and he was translating that raw data into English for my benefit. His grasp of abstract concepts began to emerge, clumsy but undeniable. We tackled the concept of tomorrow. It took a week, but once he locked onto it, his anxiety decreased. "Talk, tomorrow?" he would ask at the end of a session. "Yes," I would promise. "Talk tomorrow." He understood the continuity of time. He grasped that our connection wasn't a random event, but a schedule that extended into the future. He was planning. He was anticipating. The creature in the woods had a calendar in his mind. The dialogue revealed his curiosity about the technology he held. "Box, speak," he said one night, presumably looking at his radio. "How?" Trying to explain radio waves to a Bigfoot was an exercise in absurdity, but I tried. "Magic wind," I said, simplifying the physics. "Invisible, throw, voice." He seemed to accept this. "Good and magic," he grumbled. "Arthur, inside, box." He thought I lived inside the device, or at least that a piece of my spirit was trapped in the circuitry. In a way, he wasn't wrong. I started to learn about his personality. He was cautious, serious, but possessed a dry, observational humor. One night, I played a record of classical music thinking he might like the structure. "No," he interrupted, keying the mic over the violin solo. "Bad noise, like cat hurt." I laughed out loud, the first time I had laughed in that room in years. He didn't like Mozart. He preferred the deep rhythmic thrum of the generator or the low notes of my voice. He had aesthetic preferences. He was an individual, not just a specimen. The tapes I was recording became the most valuable artifacts on the planet. I had reels of him asking, "Why? Rain? And where in moon? Go?" These weren't the grunts of an ape. They were the inquiries of a philosopher. He was waking up to the causal relationships of the universe. Every answer I gave him seemed to spawn two more questions. He was hungry for the why of things, driven by an intellectual starvation that had likely plagued him his entire life. I was feeding a mind that had been waiting centuries for a teacher. As his English improved, he began to describe his interactions with the others, his word for the rest of his kind. Others, no. Speak, he told me, his voice dropping to a whisper. Others, run, fear. He was lonely. He was an outlier among his own people, separated by the barrier of his new knowledge. He had the fire of language, and it was burning a hole in his integration with his tribe. I realized with a pang of guilt that I was alienating him from his own world. I was making him human, and there was no cure for that. Then came the question that stopped the lesson cold. It was a calm, clear night in May. The signal was strong, 599. Arthur, he said, the syllables heavy and deliberate. Talk more. Man? He paused, the carrier wave hissing. Find more. Arthur? He was asking if there were others like me. He was asking if he could expand his social circle. He wanted to talk to the rest of humanity. I stared at the microphone, my hand hovering over the switch, realizing that my star pupil was ready to walk into a classroom that would kill him on sight. The question, find more Arthur, hung in the static like a radioactive cloud. It was the moment the experiment curdled into a crisis. I sat there, gripping the edge of the console, realizing with nauseating clarity that I had made a catastrophic mistake. By teaching the student to speak, I hadn't just given him a skill, I had given him a death wish. He assumed that because I was kind, the rest of my species was the same. He viewed language as a universal key that would unlock friendship, not realizing it was actually a target painted on his back. I looked at the glowing tubes of the transmitter, seeing them now not as a bridge, but as a trap. The radio waves we were riding didn't stop at my property line. They traveled for hundreds of miles. If the student decided to call out hello on a busy night, a trucker in Montana or a teenager in Idaho could hear him. And unlike me, they wouldn't hear a miracle. They would hear a monster. They would hear a prize to be hunted, a specimen to be caged, or a demon to be exorcised. I had handed a loaded gun to a toddler and told him it was a toy. The moral weight of what I had done crashed down on me. In my selfishness, in my desperate need to fill the silence of my own grief, I had irrevocably altered the trajectory of a sentient being. I had contaminated him with humanity. He could no longer be just a Sasquatch, content with the rhythm of the seasons and the silence of the woods. He was now a hybrid of two worlds, belonging fully to neither. I had isolated him from his own kind, who fled from his strange new sounds, and I had prepared him for a world that would destroy him on sight. I tried to explain the danger immediately. No, I said, my voice sharp with panic. No more Arthur, only me. Others. Bad. The silence on the frequency was heavy. Bad? He asked, the word rising in confusion. Arthur, good. Man, good. He couldn't reconcile the contradiction. To him, the source of knowledge and food and language was man. How could the source of good things also be the source of death? I was trying to teach the concept of treachery to a creature that only understood survival. I realized then that language is a vulnerability. A silent animal can hide. A speaking animal exposes itself. Every time he keyed that mic, he was broadcasting a beacon. Radio direction finding, fox hunting, is a basic skill for any ham operator. A dedicated team with directional antennas could triangulate his position within an hour if he kept talking. The tool I had given him to liberate his mind was the very thing that would lead the hunters to his doorstep. I had to convince him that his voice was a secret weapon, only to be used on this specific frequency, at this specific time. The paranoia set in. I started monitoring the adjacent frequencies, scanning for anyone who might be listening in. Every crackle of static sounded like a government monitoring station. Every distant voice sounded like a search party. I realized that if the world found out what I had done, I wouldn't be celebrated as a teacher. I would be vilified as the man who exposed the species. I was the guardian of the most dangerous truth on the planet, and my partner was an 8-foot giant who wanted to make new friends. I looked at the stack of tapes, hundreds of hours of evidence. They were proof of his intelligence, but they were also a roadmap to his destruction. If I released them, scientists would descend on the valley with tranquilizer darts and capture nets. They would dissect his brain to see how it processed syntax. They would put him in a zoo to see if he would ask for a banana. I had elevated him to the level of a peer, but the world would only ever see him as a lab rat. The gift of knowledge was a curse of visibility. I had to shatter his innocence. I had to teach him that I was the exception, not the rule. It broke my heart to do it. I had to take the wonder out of his voice and replace it with fear. Man, kill, I said, the words tasting like ash. Man, hunt, student. I heard a soft whimpering sound on the frequency, the sound of a child being told there is no Santa Claus, only wolves. He was learning the hardest lesson of all, that intelligence does not guarantee mercy. The responsibility shifted from education to containment. I wasn't running a school anymore. I was running a resistance cell of one. I had to teach him operational security. I had to teach him to hide not just his body, but his mind. The joyous exploration of the English language had to end, replaced by a grim curriculum of evasion. I wasn't just his teacher. I was his co-conspirator in a crime against the natural order, and the only way to keep him safe was to make him terrified of the very thing he wanted to join. I grabbed a fresh legal pad and tore up the lesson plan for the solar system. It didn't matter if he knew about Jupiter. It mattered if he knew what a rifle sounded like. It mattered if he knew how to identify a Forest Service truck versus a civilian car. I picked up my pen, my hand shaking, and wrote a new heading at the top of the page, Survival Protocols. The time for poetry was over. We were entering the war phase of his education. The curriculum changed overnight. The English literature and history books were returned to the shelf, replaced by the grim pragmatism of guerrilla warfare. I stopped teaching him how to conjugate verbs and started teaching him how to profile threats. Gun, I said, holding a rifle up to the microphone, then cycling the bolt so the metallic clack-clack rang out over the airwaves. Sound is death. I fired a blank into the ground outside, the crack echoing through the open window. Run from sound. It was a brutal lesson, stripping the world of its wonder and replacing it with ballistics. I taught him the taxonomy of vehicles. I played recordings of diesel engines versus gas engines. Truck, loud, bad, I explained. Green truck, bad. I was describing the Forest Service patrols. I taught him to distinguish the heavy, rhythmic thwump of a helicopter from the high-altitude drone of a commercial jet. Air, eye, seas, I warned him. Hide, under, tree. He absorbed the information with a somber intensity, his voice losing the playful lilt it had developed in the spring. He sounded like a soldier receiving a briefing before a deployment. We spent weeks on the concept of tracks. I explained that his footprints were a trail of breadcrumbs leading the enemy to his door. Step on rock, I instructed. Step in water. He understood the physics of it. No, Mark, he grunted back. Ghost, walk. He was adopting the terminology of evasion. He began to report his movements differently. Instead of telling me where he was, he told me how he was hidden. Shadow. Keep me, he would whisper. He was learning to erase himself from the narrative of the forest. The hardest part was demonizing my own species. I had to teach him that a smile could be a trap and that a camera was just as dangerous as a gun. Man wants picture, I explained. Picture brings many men. It was a complex causal chain to convey, that being seen led to being hunted, but he grasped it. The betrayal in his silence was palpable. He had wanted to join the human race, and I was telling him that the entry fee was his life. I was smashing the mirror he had tried to look into. I established strict radio protocols, no transmissions during daylight hours, no transmissions if the wind was blowing from the town. I taught him a kill code. 3 rapid clicks of the mic button meant emergency, go silent immediately. We drilled it like a military unit. I would click 3 times, and he would cut his transmission mid-sentence, vanishing into the static. It broke my heart to silence him, to force that magnificent voice back into the throat that had worked so hard to open it. But silence was the only armor I could give him. The stack of reel-to-reel tapes on my shelf grew to over 200 hours. They were a physical manifest of a tragedy. The early tapes were full of joy and discovery, the voice of a being waking up to the world. The later tapes were dark, filled with warnings and the hushed, paranoid whispers of 2 fugitives. I looked at those spinning reels and realized they were the only legacy we would leave. They documented the rise and fall of a civilization of 2. They were the black box recorder of a crash that hadn't happened yet. By late summer, the lessons were complete. He knew the difference between a predator call and a real animal. He knew the smell of gun oil. He knew that Arthur was an anomaly, a glitch in the programming of a dangerous species. The question stopped. He didn't ask why anymore. He only asked, safe? The intellectual curiosity that had burned so brightly was dampened by the wet blanket of survivalism. I had saved his life, perhaps, but I had extinguished the spark of his innocence. The end wasn't dramatic. It was necessary. I told him that the radio itself was a danger, a signal flare in the dark. Box. Sleep. Now, I told him one evening in September, my voice cracking. Student. Smart. Student. Safe. No. Talk. There was a long silence on the frequency, a heavy breathing presence that filled the room. Then, a single soft sentence came back, clearer than any he had ever spoken. Teacher. Good. Arthur. Friend. It was his graduation speech. I turned off the transmitter that night and didn't turn it back on. I dismantled the antenna the next day, leaving the shack a silent tomb of electronics. I still live in the cabin, an old man with a wall of tapes he can never play for anyone. Sometimes when the wind howls through the Bitterroot Valley, I think I hear a low, gravelly voice in the static of the trees. I don't reach for the radio. I just smile and pour a cup of coffee, knowing that the silence means he learned the lesson well. He is out there, he is alive, and most importantly, he is quiet. The 200 hours of tape sit in a lead-lined box in my basement labeled Geological Surveys 1991-1992. If I die, they will be burned. The world isn't ready for the voice of the student. They wouldn't hear the poetry. They would only hear the prize. I gave him the English language, but the greatest gift I gave him was the wisdom to stop using it. I am the teacher who taught his student to forget him. And in that forgetting, we both found a way to survive the truth.